17 years, the Vorith had seen every human heartbeat on BNIV, and for 14 of those years, an old man in a buried room, been teaching molecules how to lie. His name was Wen Hua, and his hands shook only when he was not working. When he held a pipette, they were steady as a child sleeping. When he held a teacup at evening, they would set up a tiny tremor that traveled through porcelain like a rumor. He had a way of breathing in through his nose and out through his teeth, slow even, breath of a man who has spent a great deal of time waiting for slow things to finish. The lab was 40 meters down, carved out of the basalt the colonists had hit when they tried to dig wells in the 3rd year. It was supposed to have been a water cistern. It held 312 glass vessels, 2 cracked centrifuges he had rebuilt with watchmaker's tools, and 1 young woman who refused to leave even when the air recyclers coughed, and the lights browned out, and the ceiling threw down a thin sift of dust whenever the Vorith ships passed close overhead. Her name was Jhone. She had been born here. She had never breathed any air but this air, never seen any sky but the dim orange the Vorith left them, never known any sound at dusk but the soft chiming the enemy ships made when they passed. A sound the colonists had learned to call temple bells, because the alternative was to call it what it was. She had come down the ladder for the first time, 3 years ago. She had stood at the bottom in a clean coverall too big for her, and looked at the 312 vessels and the 2 centrifuges and the old man hunched over the bench, and she had said, "Doctor, the surface office says you need an engineer. I am the engineer they sent." He had not looked up from the bench. He had said, "How old are you, child?" She had said, 23. He had said, "Then you are not old enough to be down here. Go back up." She had said, "My mother died in the 7th assault. She used to clean her rifle on our kitchen table. She told me, before she went out the door that morning, that if anyone ever asked me to do something useful in this war, I should say yes." She did not come back. No one has asked me anything useful since. I am asking you, doctor, please ask me something useful. He had looked up. He had taken off his glasses. He had looked at her for a long time. Then he had pointed at the centrifuge that was making the wrong sound, and he had said, "Fix that," and she had fixed it, and she had been there every day since. Doctor, he did not look up. Third dilution is holding. He set the pipette down. He turned. He let himself feel it for 1 second. The way a man lets himself sip from a flask he has been saving, and then he put the feeling away again. "Show me." She brought him the slide. He fitted his glasses, the chain ticking against the front of his coverall, and bent to the microscope. The cells in the smear were not invisible. They were translucent. They were the color of nothing in particular, the color of a window that has just been wiped. They flickered, only when he wanted them to flicker. When he held his breath, they were not there at all. He sat back. He took the glasses off and held them by the chain so they would not catch the light. "Jan, yes, doctor, get the wine." "There isn't any wine." "Get the thing we pretend is wine." She laughed. He had not heard her laugh in 11 days. She went to the shelf where they kept the engine cleaner ethanol in a sterile flask. She poured 2 thimbles into the kind of small porcelain cups his mother had used for soy sauce. And she brought them across the lab very carefully, as if the cups were filled with something precious, instead of something that would clean a wine. They touched cups. They drank. He coughed. She coughed. 14 years, she said. 14 years. It works. On cells in a dish. The leap to a body. Doctor. He looked at her. It works. He nodded, and the nod was small, and the smallness of it was the only honest size for what he felt. Above them the ceiling shivered. A long, low chime moved across the rock and through the bottles and out the other side. Jan glanced up. He did not. He had stopped looking up years ago. There was nothing to see up there that he had not already seen and grieved. "Viewing pass," she said. "Yes. They're going slow tonight." "Yes." She wrapped her arms around herself. The Vorith viewing passes laid a pale green wash across the colony, a light that crawled into every room and lit every face, and held there for 90 seconds while the hive remembered you. The light could not enter the cistern. He had chosen the depth carefully, but it entered the colony above, and they both knew that somewhere in the green a child was crying and an old woman was clutching her bed frame and praying in 3 languages to anything that might still be listening. In the building above them, in apartment 4G, An old woman named Aunt May was lying in her bed with her hands folded on her chest, and the green light came in through her thin curtain and laid itself across her quilt and her face. She was 81. She had lost 2 sons and 1 husband to the war, and she had told her daughter-in-law the week before that she had decided to stop being afraid because being afraid had become more tiring than dying. The light moved across her, and she breathed in, and she breathed out, and she did not breathe in again. Her daughter-in-law would find her in the morning with the same hands folded and the same small smile. The Voreth would have noted, in their catalog, the absence of 1 heartbeat from apartment 4G, and the catalog would update without comment because the Voreth did not understand the difference between dying of being old and dying of being afraid, and they had counted both for 17 years without distinguishing. When Hua did not know about Aunt May, he would never know. But he knew in the Greens somewhere and Aunt May was always dying, and that was the arithmetic of the war he had spent 14 years trying to change. He poured a second thimble for her. "Drink," he said, "then sleep tomorrow. We begin the live trial." She did not move. "Who?" she said. "Sit down, Yan." "Who is the trial?" "Sit down." She sat. She set the cup on the bench. She did not drink it. "I am 67 years old," he said, "and I have a tremor in the offhand and a heart that listens to no one. If the serum kills, it kills me and you finish the work, doctor. And if it does not kill, then we will have the most precious thing this colony has owned since the day we stopped owning the sky. It should be me, it will not be you. Why? Because you are young. That is not a reason. It is the only reason I have ever needed for anything." She looked away. He saw her jaw work the way it had worked the day she had come down the ladder for the first time. 3 years ago, 23 years old, and angry at every grown person who had not yet won the war for her. She had been angry then about her mother. She was still angry now in a quieter way about everything else. "Sleep," he said. "I will be here when you wake." She drank her thimble. She went up the ladder to the bunk room they had hung in the side passage. He listened to the ladder rungs until they stopped speaking, and then he sat for a long time with his hands on the bench and watched the cells in the dish, and beyond the basalt, the ceiling shivered again with a second pass, and somewhere a child was crying, and the lab was very quiet, and his life's work sat on the bench in a small sealed vial, the size of his smallest finger, and he was afraid in a way he had not been afraid since the morning he had stood at his wife's bedside and watched her stop being a person. Breathed in through his nose. He breathed out through his teeth. He drank the vial. The first thing was cold, not in his mouth, in his blood. It moved up the inside of his arms the way a slow tide moves up a beach, and he could feel his fingers going first, going quiet, going still in a way that had nothing to do with movement. He looked at his hand. His hand was there. Then his hand was a suggestion of a hand. Then his hand was the air where a hand had once been. He laughed once, a small dry sound, and the laugh did not echo because the laugh was not in any place anymore. He stood. He could feel the floor under his feet. Feet were not in the room. He raised what had once been an arm and watched the bench behind the place his arm had been, and the bench was just a bench, and he understood for the first time the size of what he had made. He had 47 minutes. He had timed the cells in the dish. He went up the ladder. He climbed it the way he had climbed it 10,000 times, and, at the top, he eased open the maintenance hatch and stepped onto the colony's main avenue at 3 in the morning, with the orange dust drifting along the gutters and a Voreth patrol, of 4 moving down the far side of the street. He stood 10 meters from them. He stood still. He breathed in through his nose and out through his teeth. They did not see him. Their eye clusters slid across the avenue, the way a slides across a sleeping cheek looking for a tear, and they slid across him, and through him, and past him, and they did not see him. He walked to the corner. He touched the wall. He touched the cold metal of the lamppost. He stood under a window where he had once heard a baby cry, 11 years before, and there were no babies in that window anymore, but he stood there anyway, and the patrol turned the corner and was gone, and he was alone on the avenue in a body that did not exist. He walked further. He walked the avenue he had walked 10,000 times as a young researcher with his briefcase, and he walked it now as a piece of weather, as a draft that moved between the buildings. He passed the tea shop that had been the tea shop for 31 years. He passed the corner where his wife had once dropped a bag of oranges, and the oranges had rolled out into the street, and a stranger had helped her pick them up. He passed the small park where his daughter had taken her first steps. The park was a fenced lot now, and the fence was rusted, and the swings were gone. But the small concrete frog that had been at the center of the park was still there, and someone had painted its eyes white in the last 17 years. And he stood in front of the small concrete frog, and he looked at its white eyes, and he did not exist, and the frog's white eyes did not see him. And somehow this was the moment in which he understood that he had become a ghost in his own life, and that his life had become a place where ghosts could finally do useful work. He closed his eyes and let himself weep without sound, because the thing was true, and the thing he had made was true, and he was an old man, and he was crying in the middle of an enemy street, and not even his own tears could be seen. He went back down the ladder. He sat at the bench. He waited for his hands to come back. They came back, finger by finger, like a flower opening in the wrong direction. He looked at his hands. He thought, "These hands will outlive me by minutes only, and that is enough." Yan was on the lower rung of the ladder. She was looking at him. "You drank it," she said. "I drank it. Without me." "Yes." She came down. She walked to the bench. She did not look at him. "My turn," she said. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He nodded. She drew her own dose. She measured it. She set it on the bench between them. She looked at him with that flat, steady look she had inherited from her mother, and that he had never been able to argue with from either of them. "Doctor," she said, "turn around." "Why?" "Because the serum is in the blood, not the cloth. And I am not going to do this with you watching me." He turned around. He faced the wall. He listened. He heard her unzip her coverall. He heard the soft thump of a sleeve sliding off a wrist. He heard her boots, one then the other, on the floor. He heard the small startled breath of a person who has just felt something she has never felt before. He heard a glass click against the bench, and a swallow. And after the swallow, there was a silence so complete that he could hear the dust falling. And then he heard her laugh. It was the same laugh from the wine. It was a sound he had not earned and would never earn. And she was 26 years old, and she was laughing for the first time in months. And the laugh moved around the lab the way a moth moves around a lamp, here and there and nowhere, because she was nowhere. And then he heard her humming. It was a song from the children's broadcasts of his own boyhood, a song the colony's old people sometimes sang at festivals when they had drunk enough to remember Earth, a song about a man named Ali Baba, who carried the stars in his pockets and the sun on his shoulder, and who was never afraid of the dark. A song his mother had hummed while she did the dishes. A song Yan's mother had hummed while she cleaned her rifle. He stood with his face to the wall, and the song moved through the lab, and a coverall lifted itself off the floor, and folded itself, and laid itself across the back of a chair, and a pair of boots arranged themselves neatly under the chair, and Yan's voice said, near his ear, near and warm and very young, "Doctor." Around, he turned. There was no one there. The chair held a coverall. The floor held a pair of boots. The song moved. "You see?" said the voice. "I see," he said, and his voice was thick, and he did not bother to thin it. "I see, child. Don't cry, doctor. I am not. You are." "I am an old man," he said. Old men weep at music. He did not know what made him do it. He stepped forward into the empty air where her voice had come from, and he raised his hand, and he found her cheek. He felt the small warmth of her face under his palm, and there was no face to see, but the warmth was Yan, and the warmth was the warmth of every young woman he had ever loved and lost and failed, and he held his hand there for 1 second, and then he took it away. "Get dressed," he said. "We have very little time, doctor. We have very little time, Yan." The song stopped. The coverall lifted off the chair. Above them, third pass of the night moved across the colony. The lab shivered. They did not look up. That night he did not sleep. He sat at the bench with the small empty vials in front of him, and he turned them slowly in his fingers, and he thought about the thing he had made. He had made a way to be unseen. He had spent 14 years on it, because he had believed, in the way a man believes the things that keep him working, that being unseen would be a kindness, that a colony of unseen children would be a colony of living children, that the old grandmother in apartment 4G, whom he did not know, would not have died If the green light could have crossed the quilt without finding, but unseen was a thing that could be sold. Unseen was a thing that could be stolen. Unseen was a thing that could kill a fat scene administrator in his study, while his late wife's pearls sat behind a painting of a heron. He had known this for 14 years, in the abstract, and he had told himself for 14 years that the abstract was not the same as the real, and now it was the real. And there was a quiet little man named Lin Wei on the upper rungs of his ladder whom he had not yet caught noticing, and the real was coming for him faster than the abstract had ever prepared him for. He set the vials down. He breathed in through his nose and out through his teeth. He thought, this is a thing that should not exist. He thought, this is a thing that must exist for 16 more days, and then it must not exist. And the man who held it in his hands at the end will have to be a man who is willing to stop existing along with it. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. There was no work in front of them now. The work was done. The work was in the vial. He thought, all right then. There was a third person in the lab. There had been for 3 years. His name was Lin Wei. He was a maintenance technician. He came down once a week to change the air filters and check the water recycler and replace the bulbs that had blown, and he was a quiet, polite man with a face you could not have described an hour after meeting him. He had been stealing reagent in tiny increments for 11 months, not enough to be missed. A milliliter here, a milliliter there. He had a small refrigerated case in his apartment in the lower colony, and in the case he had built up, drop by drop, a sample large enough to interest the kind of people who paid for things in the lower colony. The night Yan tested the serum, he was on the ladder. He was supposed to have come down at 6. He had come down at 4. He had stood on the upper rungs in the dark for a long time and listened. He had not understood everything he heard. He had understood enough. He sold the sample the next morning, in the back of a tea shop in Sector 9, to a man named Bao who ran a card game and 3 other things and who paid in old colonial silver, because the colony's electronic ledger was monitored by both the security ministry and, in some quieter way, by the Vorith. Bao used the sample that night. The colonial administrator for the Eastern Reach was a man named Fu, 61 years old, fat and decent and tired, spent for wanting transit papers for refugees, and who kept his late wife's pearls in a small safe behind a painting of a heron. He was reading in his study at 10:30. He heard nothing. He felt nothing. The knife went in under the ribs from behind, and his last thought, the security cameras would later show by the way his face moved, was a kind of mild surprise, as if someone had whispered an unexpected name behind him at a party. The pearls were taken. The safe was emptied. The cameras showed Fu alone in the room, alone when he stood up, alone when the knife appeared in his back as if growing out of the air, alone when he fell, alone when the safe opened by itself and emptied itself into the air. The security chief was a woman named Tang. She had been a friend of Wen Hua's once, 20 years before, when they had both still believed in friendship. She watched the footage 3 times. She did not blink. She put on her coat. She walked to the lab. She came down the ladder without knocking. Hua, she said. He looked up from his bench. Yan, behind him, stilled. Tang. Hua, I am going to ask you one thing and I want you to answer me one way. Ask. Did you make this? He held her eyes. I made nothing that should leave this room. She looked at him for a long moment. She had a face that had been beautiful once and was now only honest, which was, he had always thought, the better of the two. Hua, she said. There is a dead man. There are pearls missing. There is footage I cannot show to anyone. The Vorith have a clip of that footage. They have had it for an hour. They are going to ask. They are going to ask. They are going to ask you, Hua. They will not ask politely. I know. Give me the work. Give me what you have made. Let me put it in a vault and burn the vault. Let me end this here. He did not answer. Hua, please. Tang, he said, sit down. Have a thimble of what we pretend is wine. She did not sit. She looked at Yan. She looked at the bench. I am going to have to arrest someone, she said. I am going to have to give the colony a face for this. The Vorith will see the face. The Vorith will be pacified for 2 days, 3. That is all the time I can buy you. Tang. I am going to arrest her, Hua. He stood up. Pet in his hand cracked. He did not feel it crack. He felt the small sweat of his own blood across his fingers, and he did not look at it. No, he said. Yes, Tang. It has to be a person they can see. It has to be someone in the lab. It has to be someone whose absence does not destroy the work. If I take you, the work stops. If I take her, the work continues. And in 3 days you give me the work, and I give you the girl, and we all walk out of this room with our skins. Do you understand me, Hua? Do you understand what I am offering you? He looked at Yan. Yan was not looking at him. Yan was looking at her own hands. Doctor, Yan said quietly. It's all right. No, doctor. 3 days. 3 days. Tang took her by the elbow. Tang did not handcuff her. Tang led her up the ladder, the way you might lead a younger sister out of a room where the adults were going to say something the younger sister did, not need to hear. At the top of the ladder, Yan looked down once. He saw her look. He could not give her anything to take with her, so he gave her the small nod he had given her when she had first shown him the third dilution. And she took the nod, and she went. He sat down, his hands flat on the bench. He waited for them to stop shaking. They did not stop shaking. He understood that they were not going to stop shaking. Not in this room, not anymore. And that the only thing left to do was the work the trembling hands had been built for. The Vorith broadcast came at noon the next day. It came on every screen and every speaker, and inside the head of every colonist who had a translator, implant. And the colonists who did not have implants heard it anyway. Because the Vorith spoke in a frequency that the bones of the inner ear understood without consulting the brain. It was not a voice. It was a humming, layered, the sound of a hive remembering how to be patient. Deliver the method, the humming said. Deliver the method by the third sunset. The method is not yours. The method is a theft from the order of seeing. Turn it. The colony heard. The colony went very quiet. The colony, 800,000 strong, looked at its own hands and at its windows, and at the orange sky. Captain Hao came to the lab at 3 in the afternoon. He came down the ladder loud. He was a man who did everything loud, because he had decided early in his life that quiet was the property of dead men. Dr. Captain, I want it. I am sure you do. 500 men, picked the best. I put them in their throne ship at midnight. By dawn we have killed every Vorith who has ever set foot on this rock. Captain, we could win, Hua. First time in 17 years we could win. He looked at Hao. Hao was 42 years old and had a scar across the bridge of his nose from the second siege and 3 children he had not seen in 11 years, because they were in the deep colonies and the deep colonies were sealed. Captain, he said, sit down. Hao did not sit. Sit down. Hao sat. You will not win, he said. With respect, doctor, you will not win. Captain, and I am going to tell you why, and you are going to listen. Because I have been alive 25 years longer than you and I have buried. More people than you have commanded. Hao opened his mouth. Hao closed his mouth. The Vorith do not see the way we see. They do not see with eyes. They see with a hive. The first time you put 500 invisible men in their throne ship, the hive notices that 500 of its expected human heartbeats are missing from the colony below. The hive does not need to see you. The hive needs only to count us. We are 800,000. The day we are 799,500. The hive knows where the missing 500 have gone. And then they learn, Captain. They learn the pattern. They learn the frequency of the serum. They build a countersense. And the next time we try to hide a single child in a basement, they find that child in 11 seconds, and they did not used to be able to find that child at all. Hao stared at him. The first time the formula leaves this room, he said, is the last time it ever works. Do you understand, Captain? It is a one-stroke knife. You strike with it once. You strike well. You never strike with it again. Then strike once, Hao said. Strike with me, 500 men, no. Doctor, no, Captain. Then what? He looked at Hao for a long time. He looked at him the way a father looks at a son, who has asked a question the father has been dreading for years. One man, he said, one stroke, one man who is already mostly gone. Hao went pale. Hao understood. Hao opened his mouth one more time, and then he closed it, and he stood up, and he climbed the ladder, and he did not look back, because he was a soldier, and he understood the difference between an argument and an order, and he had just heard an order spoken by a man, with no authority to give it, and every authority that mattered. That night when Hua destroyed the lab, he did it slowly because the work deserved slowness. He took the notebooks down off the shelf one by one, 14 years of them, leather-cornered, the pages soft as cloth from his thumbs, and he burned them in the small stove he had used in winter to keep the cultures warm. He burned them one by one and watched the pages curl, and he read the last entry of each book before he burned it. And the last entries were the small, dry observations of a man who had spent his life trying to be useful. Dilution 14 holding at 37°C. Subject reports no nausea. Centrifuge bearing replaced. Yan's birthday. Gave her tea. He read a middle entry of book 7, the book from the 8th year. The entry said, wife's birthday today. Made the broth she used to make. Cried into it. Wasted the broth. Tomorrow I will not waste the broth. He read it twice. He burned it. He read the first entry of book 1, the book from the 1st year. The entry said, began work today. Believe a serum is possible. Believe I am the man to make it. Believe I have time. He read it 3 times. He burned it. He poured the cultures into the acid bath. He poured them slowly, vial by vial, because the cultures were the closest thing he had ever had to children after his daughter died. And he had named several of them privately, and he wanted to say goodbye to each one as it went into the bath. The acid bubbled. The cultures dissolved. The smell was the smell of the end of something. He smashed the centrifuges with the watchmaker's hammer because he wanted to be the one who broke them, not the Vorith and not the colony's security, and not anyone else who would never understand the smallness and the patience and the love that had built them. He smashed them, and the brass pieces flew, and he gathered the brass pieces and dropped them in the acid bath with the cultures. And at the end of an hour the lab held no work, no notes, no machine that could continue the work. Nothing but 2 thimble cups and a man. He stood in the middle of the lab. He looked at the empty shelves. He looked at the empty bench. He looked at the small stove with its gray ashes. He thought, 14 years. He thought, all of it gone in an hour. He thought, this is what 14 years looks like when it is finished. This is how small it becomes. This is the size of a life when the life is done. He kept 2 vials. He put them in his coat pocket. He put the coat on. He climbed the ladder. He walked to the holding cell at the security ministry. He did not hurry. He nodded at the people he passed, and they nodded at him, because he was an old man in a coat, and they had no reason to look at him twice. The guard at the cell was a young man named Liu, whose grandmother had been one of Wenhua's first patients when he had still done medicine 20 years before. Wenhua took out the small jade pendant that had been his mother's, that he had carried since he was a boy, and he held it up. Liu, he said. Dr. Wen, your grandmother liked jade. Yes, doctor, take it. Take it home to your mother. Take it to the salt flats with your mother in 2 days. Because in 2 days this colony is going to be a different place, and the salt flats are going to be the only place worth being. Do you understand me? Liu looked at the jade. Liu looked at him. Doctor, take it. Liu took it. Liu unlocked the cell. Yan was sitting on the cot. She stood up when he came in. She did not say anything. He set 1 vial on the small metal table. Drink this, he said. Then go up to the surface. Don't take anything with you. Walk to the western gate. Walk past the gate into the salt flats. Don't look back. Hum the song. Stay invisible until you are over the 2nd ridge. By then I will be. He did not finish the sentence. Doctor, drink it, Yan. Doctor, what are you going to? Drink it. She looked at him. She looked at the vial. She looked at him again. It should be us both, she said. It is us both, he said. It is just that one of us is going east and one is going west. She picked up the vial. She held it. She did not drink it. Yan, doctor, Yan. I am 67 years old, and my hands shake when there is no work, and the only work left is a thing only one man can do. And that man is me. You are 26. You have not yet seen the sky of earth. You have not yet hummed your song to your own child. Drink the vial. Just the salt flats. Forget you ever knew me. If anyone ever asks, this work never existed. There was no lab. There was no old man. There was only a war and a colony and a song some children used to sing. She drank the vial. She faded. Her hands went first, then her face. The cot creaked as she stood. He felt her in front of him in the small cell, the small warmth of her, and then he felt her lips against his cheek. And the lips had no face, and the warmth was the warmth of a young woman saying goodbye to an old man. And his eyes closed for the 2nd time in 2 days without his permission. Walk west, he said. Hum the song. Yes, doctor. She left. He could not hear her leave, because she had no body to make a sound. But he felt the cell go empty. He stood there for a long moment, breathed in through his nose and out through his teeth. He walked out of the cell. Lu was looking at the floor. Lu did not look up. East Gate, Wenhua said. I am going east, doctor. Take your mother to the salt flats, Liu. He walked east through the colony. The light was the orange light of an evening in a place that had no evenings worth the name. He passed a tea shop where two old men were playing chess. He passed a stall where a woman was selling steamed buns wrapped in clean cloth. He stopped at the stall. He bought one. He paid in colonial silver. He ate it standing in the street slowly, because it was the best bun he had eaten in 11 years, and he wanted to remember the taste. And the woman who had sold it to him said, Doctor, you all right? And he said, Yes, Auntie, I am very all right. And he bowed to her, and she bowed back without knowing why, and he walked on. At the east gate he stopped. The Vorith landing field began 200 meters past the gate. The flagship hung above it, low, a black shape that swallowed half the sky. He drank the second vial. The cold moved up his arms. His hands went, his feet went. He looked down at himself, and there was nothing to see, and he understood, for the second and final time, the size of what he had made. He walked through the gate. The guards did not see him. He walked across the landing field. The Vorith sentries did not see him. He walked up the gangway of a shuttle that was about to lift. He stepped aboard. The shuttle lifted. He held a rail he could not see and rose into the dark hanging shape. And inside the dark hanging shape the corridors were lit in the cold green of the viewing pass light, and the corridors were vast, and they smelled of nothing he had a word for. Corridors of the Vorith ship were not corridors. They were the inside of a chest cavity, dark and ribbed and wet. The walls were not walls. They were a soft chitinous tissue that breathed in slow swells, as if the ship itself were a sleeping animal he was walking through. The deck under his feet gave very slightly with each step the way moss gives. The light came from no source he could see. It came from the walls themselves, a green that was the green of pond, water in late summer, the green of something that had been alive too long. He passed Vorith in the corridors. They moved in groups of 3 and 4, never alone the way the cells of a body move. Their bodies were tall, segmented, with long delicate hands that hung at the wrong angle. Their eye clusters were arranged in rings around the head, and the rings rotated very slowly, scanning. He stood still as they passed. Could smell them up close. A smell like the inside of an old library and the smell of a wet stone. They did not see him. He moved on. He had 11 years of their language in his head. He had spent the 11 years on it the way a man digs a well in his back garden, a little each day, because a man without water cannot live, and a man without an enemy's language cannot win. He had begun the year his wife died. He had not told anyone. He had not told Yan. He had not told Tong. He had not told the dead. Every night for 11 years. After the lab work was done, he had sat at the bench with a tablet and a recorded transmission and a notebook, and he had teased apart the humming pheromonal layers of the Vorith hive speech, and he had learned, slowly, the way a child learns, the way of saying things in a language that had not been built for a mouth. He had built one sentence over those 11 years. He had built it the way a man builds a small boat in his garage that he does not know he will ever launch. He had built it because there were things he wanted to say to them once, before he stopped. And he wanted to say those things in their own language, because that was a courtesy he believed was owed even to an enemy. He walked the corridors. He knew where to go. He had known for 9 years. The central registry. The place where the hive remembered every human face it had ever scanned, every heartbeat it had counted, every bone shape it had filed and named and learned, was at the ship's heart. He had built a small thing in his lab over 4 years. A small thing the size of his thumb. A small thing that did not explode and did not burn and did not kill, but that broadcast, at a very particular frequency, a very particular pulse, a pulse that erased. He had it in his pocket. He took it out. It was warm. He came to the registry. The room was a column of light. The column held, in flickering moving glyphs, the cataloged shape of every human on Bihanive. 800,000 small fires, each one a person, each one a face the hive could find in an instant in any cellar or behind any wall. He stood at the base of the column. He looked up. He thought of his wife. He thought of his daughter. He thought of Yan's mother, whom he had known in his middle years. He thought of Yan, who would be at the second ridge by now humming. He placed the small warm thing at the base of the column. He triggered it. It was not a sound. It was a silence. The column flickered once, and then the 800,000 small fires went out. One and then the next and then the next. Very fast, the way a wave breaks the wrong way and pulls the sand out from under a child's feet. The hive's certainty went. The catalog went. The shape and the name and the heartbeat of every human on BNIV. Every face the Vorath had spent 17 years learning went out of there. Memory the way a candle goes out under a hand. The alarms began to keen. He sat down on the floor of the registry. He could feel the serum thinning in his blood. The cold was leaving his hands. His hands were coming back. His feet were coming back. He looked down and saw, very faintly, the line of his own old fingers. The brown spots on the backs of them. The wedding ring he had never taken off. He smiled. He hummed the song. Ali Baba was a happy young man. He carried the stars in his pockets. He carried the sun on his shoulder. He was never afraid of the dark. The Vorath came running. They came in the way a hive comes, all at once, every direction. They saw him on the floor of the registry, an old man in a coat with his hands folded, humming. They stopped. He looked up. He spoke to them in their language. He spoke slowly, because they were not used to hearing their language from a face that had a mouth in it, and he wanted them to understand. He had built this sentence over 11 years. He had rehearsed it in the lab alone, after Yan had gone up to sleep. He had wanted at the end to be able to say something his enemy could hear. You saw everything, he said, and you still did not see this. The Vorath stood in a half-circle around him. He watched their eye clusters rotate. He watched the small ripple of their hive mind processing his words in a frequency no human had ever spoken to them in. And he watched the moment of their understanding pass through them, like a wind through tall grass. They did not answer. They could not. There was no answer to be made. He smiled at them. He kept smiling. He thought about his wife. He thought about his daughter. He thought about Yan, who would be at the second ridge by now, humming. He thought about the small concrete frog in the empty park, with its white painted eyes. He thought about how the eyes had not seen him, and how that had been a kindness, and how he had given that same kindness now to 800,000 people he would never meet. They killed him in the way they killed things, and without ceremony, because the Vorath did not understand ceremony. But the registry was empty. The catalog was gone. The hive's certainty was gone. They would have to start over. They would have to resurvey 800,000 humans, one face at a time, and they could not do that in less than 16 days, and 16 days was the only thing the colony had ever needed. The colony broke its silence at dawn. Tang gave the order, Hao executed it, every ship that could lift, lifted, every shuttle that could fly, flew. 800,000 colonists boarded everything that had ever been built to leave the ground, and the ships went up through the orange dust, and the Vorath above tried to count them, and the Vorath could not count them, because the Vorath did not remember any of their faces. The ships scattered. Some went to the salt flats, some went to the deep system, some went to the long jump and were never heard from again. And the silence of the never heard from again was a different silence than the silence of the dead. And some of the children who escaped that morning would grow up to believe, very privately, that the silence was a survival. Yan walked west across the salt flats. She walked for 11 hours. At the second ridge she became visible. She did not look back. She had been told not to. She walked another 6 hours and met a transport from the deep colonies that had come up to ferry refugees from the western gate, and she boarded it without giving her name, and the transport went into the long dark. She lived. She did the things a person does. She got older. She married, and the marriage was a good one, for as long as it lasted. And after it lasted, she lived alone for a while. And then she lived with a daughter, and then with a grandson. And the grandson was a quiet boy with a long face and serious eyes. She kept the secret. She had been told to. She had been told that the work had never existed, that there had been no old man, no buried lab, no 14 years of patient lying to molecules, and she kept the work from existing for 57 years. She did not tell her husband. She did not tell her daughter. The colony forgot, because colonies forget, and the war that had eaten her childhood became, in the histories her grandson read in school, a thing called the Bihan Withdrawal, a thing in which the Vorath had inexplicably broken off their siege and turned inward and never returned, a thing the historians explained with words like geopolitical pressures and internal hive instability, none of which were Wenhua, none of which were Yan, none of which were a thimble of engine cleaner ethanol in a porcelain cup that had once held soy sauce. She did not correct the histories. She let the histories stand. She had been told to, but she hummed. She hummed in the morning while she washed her face. She hummed in the evening while she did the dishes. She hummed in the long dark of nights when she could not sleep. And the moon of her new world rose pale and full over the porch. And the grandson, slept in the room next to hers, grew up with the song so deep in him that he would hum it himself, one day to his own children without remembering where he had first heard it. He sat by her chair on a different world, on a wooden porch, at an evening that had a real sky in it, and he asked her one evening when she was very old, "Grandmother, why do you hum that song?" She looked at him. She looked at her own hands, brown and spotted now, the way the old doctor's hands had been at the end. She had been 26 then. She was 83 now. "'Cause," she said, "I knew a man once who made himself into nothing so that the rest of us could be seen as something." The grandson did not understand. He nodded the small, polite nod of a child who has been told he will understand later. She smiled at him, and she reached out, and she put her hand on his cheek for 1 second, and then she took it away. The sky above them was real. There was a moon in it. There were stars in it. There was no orange dust, and there was no hanging black ship, and there was no green wash of viewing light, and the boy beside her was alive, and he would have children, and his children would have children, and somewhere down the line of the children, one of them would hum a song about a happy man who carried the stars in his pockets and the sun on his shoulder, without knowing where the song had come from. Because that was how songs traveled, and that was how people traveled, and that was how an old man in a buried room had paid for them all. The Vorath had eyes that could see through every wall a human ever built. We still found one wall they could not see through. We made it out of an old man.